Let me tell you something real loud and real clear. There comes a time in history when the world pauses, not because of war, not because of disaster, but because something so calculated, so brilliantly executed, and so quiet drops like a thunderclap. That's what India just did. While the rest of the world was busy underestimating, underplaying, and undermining this ancient civilization, India was sharpening its game in silence. America was playing checkers. India was already 5 moves deep into chess, and now the whole globe's got their jaws on the floor. The headlines didn't scream it at first. The Western media didn't want to admit it. But you better believe it was the kind of move that made generals scratch their heads, CEOs shuffle their strategies, and politicians stammer on podiums. Because for once, it wasn't America leading the narrative. It wasn't China pulling strings. It wasn't Russia throwing weight. It was India, and not the soft-spoken background actor India the world was used to. No, this was Bharat reborn. And it came not with threats, not with chaos, but with strategic brilliance that stunned every single power player. Watching from the sidelines, you know what's funny. They thought India was too democratic to be decisive, too spiritual to be strategic, too diverse to be disciplined. But guess what? That diversity, it's now unity, that democracy, its direction, and that spirituality, its strength. They all missed it because they were stuck looking at an India of the past. An India that's been colonized, criticized, and constantly second-guessed. But that India ain't here anymore. This India ain't seeking validation from the West. This India ain't playing catch-up. This India's writing its own rulebook. And this latest move, oh, it was a masterpiece. See, when the United States tried to trap nations in financial alliances, when Europe thought its regulatory web could slow down giants, when China tried playing the manufacturing king, and Russia pushed its weight with oil, India quietly laid down a new foundation that didn't follow their playbook. It rewrote the rules with one stroke. A move that combined economics, defense, technology, and diplomacy into one thunderous checkmate. You know how powerful a country has to be to shake the planet without firing a single bullet. That's exactly what India did, and let me be real with you. It wasn't by accident. This wasn't some lucky break or spontaneous idea cooked up overnight. This was decades of planning, years of patience, and centuries of cultural depth rising to the surface. And when the time was right, they didn't yell, they didn't beg, they just moved, and the move was so precise, so calm, so shockingly effective, it made the world realize India's not reacting anymore. India's acting. They used to say the pen is mightier than the sword. Well now, it's the chip, the drone, the satellite, and the alliance, and India just mastered all 4. When America blinked, India launched. When Europe hesitated, India sealed the deal. When China flexed, India countered, quietly, strategically, relentlessly. And here's the thing. This wasn't just about geopolitics. This was a mindset shift. A cultural earthquake. India didn't just outplay them. India outgrew them, out-thought them, out-hustled them. This wasn't your granddad's India. This was a nation that had studied every play, absorbed every hit, and waited. Waited for the moment the whole world underestimated it just enough for them to make the leap. And when that moment came, India didn't hesitate. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't wait for approval. It just executed with precision, with power, with purpose. Let me break it down for you. While the world was distracted by drama, India was building partnerships. While they were arguing over ideology, India was stacking tech. While they were playing war games, India was designing self-reliant systems. Logistics locked down, supply chains secured, data encrypted, satellites launched, alliances formed, industries revived. And all of it happened without fanfare. That's what made it more deadly. See, when a nation roars, everyone's prepared. But when a nation whispers and still shifts the earth, that's when you know it's unstoppable. So what was this move? It was the formation of a strategic ecosystem that broke dependency. That's the word right there, dependency. For decades, global powers controlled weaker nations through it. Dependency on oil, dependency on dollars, dependency on trade routes, on military hardware, on pharmaceuticals, on communication networks. Dependency was the leash, and for the longest time even India was on it, but not anymore. This move was a declaration, not on paper but in practice, that Bharat is done being dependent. It created its own trade corridors, built its own payment systems, developed its own defense tech, designed its own chips, crafted its own software platforms. And here's what's got the world sweating bullets. It did all of that without crashing its economy or losing public support. Tell me, how many nations in history pulled off such a seismic shift without collapsing from within? The West thought India couldn't juggle it all. Too many religions, too many languages, too much population, too much noise. But that very complexity became its strength. It learned to multitask under chaos. It learned to innovate under pressure, and now that chaos is coordinated, that pressure is propulsion, that diversity is dominance. And when India made that move, whatever it was, be it diplomatic, technological, economic, or strategic, it carried the full weight of 4 billion minds, hearts, and souls behind it. That's not just a country making a play. That's a civilization reawakening. See, India didn't just shock the world because it did something unexpected. It shocked the world because it showed them what was possible when you stop trying to be someone else and start becoming the best version of yourself. That's what Bharat did. It stopped imitating and started innovating. It stopped complying and started commanding. It stopped waiting and started winning. And the rest of the world, they're not just surprised, they're stunned. Because now they got a deal with a new global force that doesn't need their approval, doesn't chase their funding, and doesn't follow their lead. That's terrifying to them, because power in the hands of the West was predictable. Power in the hands of India, that's a wild card, and every empire hates a wild card. Let me tell you something else. India's move didn't just challenge others, it inspired others. Nations across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. They watched what India did and started asking questions, started rethinking their own paths, started seeing a blueprint that didn't come from Washington, didn't come from Beijing, didn't come from Brussels. It came from Bharat, from a civilization that's older than time and still evolving. That's why the world is stunned, because it ain't just about India anymore. It's about what India represents. It represents self-respect, self-reliance, strategic independence, cultural pride, and it represents a quiet kind of power that doesn't need to scream to be heard. And you know what scares them the most. India didn't throw stones. It didn't burn bridges. It didn't pick fights. It just made progress, unapologetically, relentlessly, consistently, and that's the kind of power that can't be sanctioned, can't be invaded, can't be destabilized. Because it doesn't come from outside, it comes from within. That's what they didn't see coming. They were preparing for noise. They weren't ready for discipline. They expected rebellion. They weren't ready for revolution. The silent kind, the strategic kind, the Bharat kind. India's move was the kind that flips narratives, that forces boardrooms to recalculate, military analysts to rewrite doctrines, and economists to redraw projections. You can't stop a train that's already at full speed, and India, that train left the station years ago. The world just finally noticed it when it whistled past their comfort zone. That's what this moment is. A reckoning, a realization that the future ain't just American, ain't just Chinese, ain't just Western. The future now speaks Hindi, Tamil, Bengali, Sanskrit, Kannada, and 20 other tongues. The future now wears a tilak and carries a startup idea in one hand and a missile blueprint in the other. They wanted India to pick tradition or technology. India said both. They wanted India to choose spirituality or science. India said, why not both? They wanted India to compromise on security, on trade, on its values. India said not anymore, and that refusal to bow down, to play by outdated rules, that's what broke the system. That's what stunned the world, because India just walked into the room and said, we're not asking to sit at your table. We're building our own table, and you're welcome to join if you come with respect. That right there. That's power, not given, not borrowed, not stolen, earned, built, claimed, and now the world watches because the move has been made. The silence has been broken. The tide has shifted, and ancient, mighty, unshakable Bharat is no longer rising. It's risen, let me tell you something. When the world was too busy measuring power in missiles, tanks, and aircraft carriers, India was working in silence, engineering a doctrine of something far more terrifying than just hardware. It was self-reliance, not the kind that just makes headlines, but the kind that scares intelligence agencies, rattles think tanks, and forces entire governments to rewrite their playbooks. While the superpowers lined up their toys for the world to admire, flexing their military might in press conferences and war games, India did something no one expected. It turned inward, quietly, and started building a war doctrine that doesn't need validation from the West. It doesn't look for NATO's nod or Washington's approval. It doesn't wait for deals to be signed in Paris, London, or Brussels. It builds, it tests, it deploys, and it dares anyone to underestimate it again. You see, there was a time when India's military strength was treated like a side note, politely acknowledged but never feared. It had the numbers, sure, but fear, respect, dominance, that was reserved for others. That was for the big boys with their trillion-dollar budgets and intimidating alliances. But what no one saw coming was this: India wasn't trying to play catch-up. It was building a new game altogether. It was done borrowing, done importing, done depending on hand-me-downs. Instead, it invested in its scientists, backed its engineers, and trusted its own ecosystem to deliver what the world thought was impossible. India didn't just strengthen its arsenal. It redesigned the philosophy behind it. They told India, you need us to be strong. India said, we need us. They said, you'll fall behind without our tech. India said, we'll build our own. They said, without our platforms, you can't defend yourself. India smiled and built BrahMos, Agni, Tejas, Arjun, and a cyber defense unit that doesn't just protect, it predicts. It doesn't just react, it preempts. It doesn't just mirror global powers. It outpaces them in silence. While other nations hosted war games, India ran simulations no one even knew about. While others pushed propaganda, India pushed code. While others bought influence, India built resilience, and that's what changed everything. Because the greatest threat to a system designed to keep others dependent is a nation that refuses to play that role. The narrative was always this: India will rise, but only within the limits set by others. India can grow, but only under the systems designed by them. But when India began rejecting those systems, when it started designing its own rules, its own tech, its own military doctrine, the shock wasn't just in Washington. It echoed in Berlin, in Tokyo, in London, and yes, in Beijing too. India stopped asking for access and started building alternatives. It walked away from obsolete treaties and outdated pacts and began forging relationships that served its interests, not its insecurities. It knew that the new war wasn't going to be fought just on land or sea. It was going to be digital, economic, psychological. And while most nations scrambled to adapt, India was already executing. 5G, built with local input. AI, trained on Indian data. Quantum computing, no longer a Western monopoly. Hypersonic tech, feel, tested in deserts no satellite could penetrate. The world watched India launch a moon mission with a budget smaller than a Hollywood movie and still couldn't see what was coming next. But that wasn't the big win. The big win was the doctrine behind it. A doctrine that said, if it's not built in India, it can be built better in India. This wasn't about revenge or arrogance. It was about clarity. India had seen how dependency worked. It had lived through embargoes, sanctions, delayed shipments, manipulated deals, and biased terms. It had seen how the game was played, but instead of whining, it adapted. Instead of begging, it built. Instead of reacting, it designed systems that couldn't be held hostage. And while the world kept watching for troop movements and border standoffs, they missed the real revolution. India's brainpower weaponized by sovereignty. There was a time when countries would scoff at India's indigenous projects. They'd call them slow, inefficient, inferior. But today, those same nations are asking to collaborate. They want in on the missile programs. They want joint ventures on defense tech. They want access to Indian cybersecurity frameworks because what India built wasn't just made in India. It was made asterisk for asterisk India, and that made it more powerful than anything foreign made ever could be. This was not the military power of intimidation. It was the power of preparation. It was doctrine, strategy, and vision molded together by necessity and delivered through determination. India realized something early. True strength doesn't come from showing off what you have. It comes from making sure no one can take it away, and that's what Self-Reliance did. It made India unshakable, sanction, proof disruption, resistant. It made India an architect of security, not a client of it. While some nations sold weapons, India started selling systems. Ecosystems, doctrines, ideologies of strength that were built on roots deeper than contracts or cash. And what stunned the world wasn't just that India had these systems. It was how seamlessly it scaled them. Bharat started deploying satellites that gave it 24/7 surveillance of its borders, oceans, and skies. It built missile shields that operate faster than any incoming threat. It built fighter jets customized for Indian terrains and strategies, not borrowed templates from foreign wars. It built drones that fly undetected, submarines that don't show up on radar, and cyber defense units that monitor every potential breach in real time. It built communication networks that can't be jammed, nuclear subs that can stay submerged longer than anyone expected, and AI systems that can outthink an enemy before the enemy even blinks, and still, it said nothing. Because strength that speaks too loudly invites fear, but strength that remains calm, that unnerves the world. What the superpowers couldn't understand was how a nation that once depended on them was now not just independent, but capable of offering protection, strategy, and partnership to others. African nations looked toward India. Southeast Asia began aligning its defenses with Indian tech. Middle Eastern allies requested Indian missile defense systems. Even European think tanks started publishing papers not on India's rise, but on how to adjust asterisk to it. That's what Self-Reliance did. It flipped the table, because when you're self-reliant, you're not playing anyone's game. You're not worried about foreign approval. You're not bound by geopolitics. You define them, and India, with its doctrine of innovation, backed sovereignty, did just that. It stopped reacting to narratives and started shattering them. It stopped fighting for space in the global order and started becoming a pole of that order. Not West, not East India, and what no one could anticipate was how effortlessly India blended modern warfare with ancient wisdom. While the West was obsessed with tech, India combined that with terrain, tradition, and tactics. It knew when to push and when to pause. It knew the power of silence, the terror of precision, the genius of patience. It never needed to bomb to make a point. It just needed to show that it could, and that alone shook the chessboard. This wasn't a nation waiting for instructions. This was a civilization that remembered who it was, and once that awakening was complete, the rest of the world had only two options: either join hands with Bharat or prepare to be outmaneuvered, because from this point on there was no more margin for underestimating India, no more comfort in old stereotypes, no more illusion that India would stay in line, stay polite, stay dependent. That era was over. The doctrine of weaponized self-reliance had begun, and it wasn't loud. It wasn't televised, but it was permanent, and the world knew from that moment on the game had changed forever.